is our project, or we should do that, but let's do it real. So to introduce a session called the 50-50 project of the BBC, I will call Jessica Del Nogre from Letterpay. I'm sure you know her because she's been with us in Gen for a very long time. She's also been working for New York Times and Global Digital Networks, and she's now working for Letterpay. Come on, Jessica. Please. Ah tiens, toi il faut... Ah ouais, il faudrait que je t'accueille avec le micro. Ça va marcher.
No. Oh, now it works. Thank you, everyone. It is a great pleasure for me to be here today. I'll be hosting this panel with Rana Hayub and Ros Atkins from the BBC. Please join me here. Oh. Thank you both for joining me. In the past few days, I had many conversations with the audience about gender equality and specifically the representation of women in the news. While some of you have told me that more and more women are now in the news, many of you have also affirmed that there was a true need for projects such as the 50-50 project in their countries and specifically in their news. Ros, can you tell us more about the 50-50 project? And I know you also have a few stats and some data that you'd like to present to the audience today.
Hi, everyone. Well, I'll do some slides in a sec. I guess the idea behind 50-50 is a relatively simple one, which is that for years the news media has said we accept there's an issue with the underrepresentation of women, and for years it's said we would love to resolve this issue, and yet we weren't managing to resolve it. Wherever I looked in the news media, including the program I host, we weren't making as much progress as we said we would like to. And so I started to think about, well, perhaps we could take a different approach to try and make more progress. And really that's the idea behind 50-50, is that there are things that we do in journalism which we would consider non-negotiable. So when I come to work as a journalist, I want to be factually correct. I want to use clear language. I want to treat people fairly. I want to communicate the ideas and the information I have as well as I can. If you add the fair representation of women into those non-negotiables, then you very much change your mindset from it being something that you would like to do, but perhaps we can't do it, to something that actually this is what I expect of myself as a journalist, or this is what I expect of myself as an organization. And if you can flip that in your mindset and your view of this particular issue, then, in my view, some quite powerful things can happen.
And can you tell us more about the results overall? So
sure. Do you want me to do that? I was wondering if Rana wants
sure.
to. You want me to dive right in?
Okay,
let me dive right in.
The results, and then
okay.
We'll be having a conversation.
So I'm just going to give you a very quick 3-4 minute overview of what I did at the BBC, and then of course we'll have a chance to see what you make of it. But further to what I was saying there, one of the core problems I observed was not only did we signal that we liked this as a goal and we were struggling to move towards it, we had very little information about how we were actually doing. And if you want to achieve a goal, it's a good idea to know how you're doing. So data was going to be at the heart of the work that we did. But crucially, quite often diversity monitoring in news media is done by people aside from the journalists. It's done by administrative people, by management, by HR, by lots of different people, but not by the journalists. And the problem with that is you end up with some data, but the data doesn't affect change. And so I was very interested to use data as a driver of cultural change. So the data isn't the end point, the data is what's helping change the journalism that we produce. And so at the heart of 50-50 is the idea that if you make journalism, you measure it on the day that you make it. The second thing was I'd observed, and I'm sure this is true of newsrooms all around the world, that there's a resistance to having management impose diversity initiatives. People say, look, I've got enough on my plate, I haven't got time for this. So I made it completely voluntary. And as such, the people who get involved are doing so because they buy into the idea of this and they're motivated to do it. They don't have to do it. And if you're going to make something voluntary, you need to make it very attractive. And in my experience, saying increasing the representation of women in our journalism is the right thing to do is not very effective. That people have been saying that for years and it wasn't having an impact. But if you start talking about it in terms of the quality of your journalism, when I walk into the BBC every day, I'm walking in to report and analyze the world as best I can. And if I want to do that to the highest quality that I can, I need to diversify my sources. To understand our world, we've got to speak to all of the world. And if you start framing increasing the representation of women in those terms, rather than simply telling people you're not doing well enough, you should do better, then I thought that perhaps exciting things could happen. On top of that, quite often I noticed that journalists didn't like being monitored because they felt that the way they were being monitored wasn't fair. So here's an example of a number of different contributors you might see in a broadcast journalism environment. Well, actually, all of these people, Theresa May, the Prime Minister, we have no control over who the Prime Minister is. The only eyewitness to a bomb, we have no control over who that is. The host of a program. The journalists don't control the fact that I host my program. So we don't focus on those. We focus on all of the other elements of our journalism that we do control. So when the data comes through, the journalists see it as being credible, and if they see it as being credible, they're much more likely to react to it. And we have a golden rule, which is there's no compromise on quality. This isn't about a quota. This isn't about insisting that every day you reach 50% women. We aspire to reaching 50% women across every month of our output. But if on a given day the best contributors are men, every time the man goes on air or goes into our article. And at the heart of the problem that I observed with newsrooms who are struggling to make progress on this issue was you would say to people, would you like to do this? And they would say yes. And you'd say, well, how come it's not happening? And they would say it's not possible. And you can't have a credible discussion about it being possible unless you prove that it is. So this is my day job. I'm a host on a primetime news show called Outside Source, which is on BBC World News. And before I talk to anyone, I was like, I'm going to test this out on my program. So here we go, January 2017. We spent a month measuring, came out at 39% women. It was a shock. We told ourselves we were doing better. But the process of gathering the data drove engagement and motivation among my team. And this is how it went across the next few months. So by April, we'd done a whole month of output with 50% women, and we've averaged over 50% women ever since. So I had the proof. The second thing I wanted was to use peer group dynamics rather than management diktats. I thought journalists would respond better to that. And so if you're part of 50-50, you have to share your numbers with everyone else who's part of 50-50. So if you're doing well, people see that you're doing well. If you're not doing so well, you need to stand in front of your peers and justify why you're making journalism with 25% women in it. And as such, a spirit of amicable competition has emerged. We have what we call the 50-50 dashboard, where all the teams in the BBC doing 50-50 have to enter their numbers every month, and everyone can see how everyone is doing. And that has been hugely effective at driving an increase in performance. So this is what happened. From my program in January 2017, and through no one being told to do it at the BBC, it's now grown to over 500 content teams in the BBC across the whole of BBC News and elsewhere in the BBC, sport, factual, religion, science, and so on. We're up to about 4,500 content makers and journalists, and we were all working towards a goal that the head of the BBC set us in April 2019. Tony Hall said, we're going to publish our data no matter what, and he asked all the teams to see how well they could do in terms of pursuing 50% women or above in their content. And the results were quite remarkable. So these are teams who've been doing 50-50 for 12 months or more. Only 27% of them started off with a fair representation of women in their journalism. In April, 74% reached the mark. So this isn't just a small shift. This is a revolution in the makeup of our journalism. Look across the whole project. All teams, including teams which have just joined in the last month or two, 26% started on target, 57% were on target in April. And perhaps more remarkable still, and this will be of interest to Rana, I hope, across BBC World Service languages, so we broadcast in lots of different languages, we saw a jump from 17% of teams fairly representing women in their journalism to 61%. So this is BBC Hindi, BBC Persian, BBC Telugu, BBC Marathi, BBC Arabic, and so on, doing things that fundamentally they thought wasn't possible, and it turned out that it was. And my dream when I started this was if I can prove it on my show, I can hopefully prove it to other BBC News programs. If I can prove it on BBC News, perhaps I can prove it on other BBC content. And if the BBC's doing it, perhaps we can get other people involved as well. And that's what's happened. We have about 35 partners around the world. Any of you here who would like to take part, you're very welcome. We give away all of our methodology and all of the systems we have behind the project. And already we're running pilots at these guys, so Fortune and WNYC in the US, YFM in Johannesburg, YLE in Finland, ABC in Australia, other big broadcasters in the US, and to my intense excitement as well, we're now partnering with academic institutions to look at how they teach their journalism with reference to the representation of women. And crucially, we're also looking at the supply side. So we have two of the biggest PR agencies in the world, Edelman's and Lanson's, dealing with corporate clients and saying, let 50/50 help you measure who you're actually putting up for interview. So while the journalists on one side are asking for more women from the people that they want to interview, the organizations and corporate contributors, on the flip side, we now have PR agencies who are encouraging those corporates to measure who they put up. So that's exciting, and we're just starting to pilot it. And that's a very quick summary of what we've been up to.
Thank you very much, Ros. I think he deserves a round of applause for the great project he's been conducting. Rana, we're going to get to you in a second, but I just want to ask you, Ros, before, how do we make sure that this is sustainable over time?
Look, sustainability is a big challenge. I think what the BBC has learned is if you say you're going to do something publicly, you know, that's a pretty strong way of making sure that you commit to it. And when we reached April and our commitment to publish our data, I immediately went back to the BBC and we talked about, well, we can't just leave it there. We need to make a fresh commitment. So we made a fresh commitment to publish more data next spring. And so I think transparency and public commitments are a very effective tool. I think the other thing is just to keep working with people who are struggling. So I had a rule when I started this project which was only going to be positive, with no negativity, no criticism, no shaming of anyone. And so if someone or a journalist or a team is struggling with this issue, we'll go and speak to them and say, hey, we can see you're struggling here, how can we help? Rather than, what on earth are you doing, this is a disgrace. And as such, being more inclusive and being more supportive rather than driving this through lecturing people on not having done better, that's also been effective.
Thank you. Rana, you're an investigative journalist and a true voice in Asia specifically. Do you think an initiative such as the 50/50 initiative is something that would be possible in India?
Well, what Ros is doing and what the BBC is doing is truly revolutionary in every way, when for the longest time, women in journalism especially were reduced to being pretty faces on television. I can tell you from my experience, when I wanted to join journalism at the age of 19, my relatives, spoke to my parents and said, can't you get her in a more respectable profession? So you also have to look at the cultures that we are a part of. I mean, especially in Indian culture, where patriarchy is, so much a part of our culture. And, when I started journalism, I wanted to do political journalism and investigative journalism. And my editor said, you know what, women should restrict themselves to education and lifestyle and fashion. And because there are so many rapes in India, how about you, we can send you to cover a rape case because it requires the sensitivity of a woman. So that's where you start from, because you are told that women really cannot do big investigations. I went undercover for 8 months, posing as a Hindu national student, wearing 8 cameras, pulling off one of the biggest investigations, which has been called the equivalent of the Watergate scandal in India. But I remember at one of the interactions, somebody in the audience said, but it must not have been very difficult for you. You're a pretty woman, you go with a camera, men look at you and they just speak. So all my work of 8 months going undercover, suffering the nervous breakdown, everything was reduced to me being an attractive woman and not what I do and not what I bring to the profession. It is difficult in a country like India to bring about something like 50/50 yet. It's not impossible because we do have women getting into the mainstream space, a lot of them mostly on television as anchors. But it's a challenge. It's a challenge because we have to change mindsets of people and make them believe that women are equally capable. I mean, we have to start in India, we have to start from the process of sensitizing people that, women are equally good. I mean, it's frustrating that you have to keep proving yourself. Also, women, especially in India, the kind of stuff that we do, the kind of online harassment that we face. Last year, my image was doxed in a pornographic video, and that video was spread all over the country. So if somebody else is watching that, if a woman journalist is watching that from a distance, she would be like, I don't want to be in her place. Her parents would not want to be in her place. I have progressive parents, and they did not bother, but there are families in India who would not want their daughter to suffer the way I suffered doing the kind of investigative journalism that I wanted to. So we have a long way to go. We need to start with the process of sensitizing people towards women in journalism.
And also probably a process of creating a safe space for women.
Absolutely. I think, especially in a country like India, I mean, we need to create a safe space for women, not just in newsrooms, but when they go out to report, when, you know, the kind of adversaries they face. I mean, the ruling party in India, you know, it has been, I mean, I got the first serving Home Minister of India arrested in 2010, and now he's the second most powerful man in India, and he's made my life miserable. I changed about 20 SIM cards in 1 year. That's how difficult my life is. I'm doxxed. People follow me. When I'm on television, I get messages saying, you know, we are downstairs, we're waiting for you. You're so, I mean, at airports, people come this close to me and threaten me. So how do you address that? I filed a case against all the fake news which is being disseminated against me by the ruling government last year, but there was nothing. There was no justice for journalists like me. So there has to be a recourse. We have to create a safe space for women to be able to do that without the misogyny and the misogynistic attacks they're subjected to.
I think, you know, a lot of the obstacles that we're coming up against with 50/50 at the BBC don't, you know, are nothing compared with what you're facing. But one of the things that we've thought very carefully about is, why are women saying no more than men when we ask them to be contributors in our journalism, which is what's happening, and to try and understand more about how we can create journalistic environments which women would like to take part in. And there isn't one answer, and actually if you ask 10 women who say, no, I don't want to be a contributor on your program, you'll get 10 different answers, and so I'm not going to start making generalizations. But we need to start from the point that we have to represent women fairly in journalism, and we work back from that. We don't start from the point of, oh, I wish we could do it, but they're saying no for these different reasons. We just need to start from the point of, we need these people within our journalism, so what do we need to do to make that a more comfortable experience for them?
Ros, how can we encourage men to be more supportive of these initiatives?
Well, I think lots of men have been very supportive. I think one of the things I noticed in myself was that I was and I remain anxious about stepping into this issue because there's a grave risk of virtue signaling and a grave risk of mansplaining and lots of things which I don't want to do. But I think that what I'd observed in myself was that I wanted this issue to be fixed, and I was supportive of others who wanted to fix it, but I wasn't going the next step, which was to actually get involved. I was kind of signaling from the side that I approved, but I wasn't actually getting involved. I think what's become important with 50/50 is, and you know, the name suggests that we're committed to this, is that the people who are involved in making it a success are both men and women at the BBC, and if I made you a list of the people who had been central to its success, there would be as many men as there would be women. And I think the thing that's made it easier for me to do that is framing it in terms of the quality of our journalism and the popularity of our journalism. Those are two things all journalists are interested in, making the best work you can and making it seen by as many people as possible. And when you start framing it in those ways, then I think it becomes very easy for men to get behind that idea. But, you know, it's still something which I tread carefully on, because I'm aware that on one level it's reasonably odd for me to be doing this.
Is there any best practices that you'd like to share with the audience, and even with, you know, cultures that could be not to that extent? So
Rana may well have some thoughts on this as well from her newsroom experience in India, but the couple of things that have been really revolutionary for me in my experience is I don't try and persuade anyone to do it. So if I talk to someone about 50/50 and they're like, I don't think I need to do this, or I don't think I want to do this, or it doesn't work for me, I might give them some reasons why I think they might want to consider that decision, but I'm not going to, it's the softness of sells. I make the case for it, and if they don't want to take part, that's absolutely fine. So you use all of your energy working with people who want to do it, and none of your energy trying to persuade people who don't want to do it. Now, at the beginning, that means you end up with quite a small project, but what actually happened was that as it reached a critical mass, it developed a momentum of its own that was all coming from a place of, I'd like to do this, not I'm being forced to do this. And people are much more likely to make something a success if they have chosen to do it rather than being
and that's what you were highlighting,
told to do it. So that's not trying to persuade people who are not into it has been revelatory. And then the other thing I would emphasize is the peer group, which is rather than try and persuade a whole department of teams in the BBC newsroom, I would just try and find one or two teams who I thought would like to do it, and then they turn it into a success, and before you know it, the whole department wants to do it, but you haven't had to spend lots of time persuading all of those teams. They've come to you at their own speed, and that's been very powerful, actually, because you have more time, you have more energy, and very little bad feeling. But Rana, your experience in Indian newsrooms must be quite, I'm sure, is quite different to my experience in London.
I think in Indian newsrooms, most of the television shows are mostly manuals. You have a one-odd woman because, you know, you have to have a one-odd woman to have equal representation. But when we talk about equal representation, we have about 7 men on the panel with 1 woman who comes in an odd, you know, just to fill in that space. I mean, we have struggled to be where we are. We have tried to break the glass ceiling because we are, I mean, when it comes to reportage, how often do you see women on the front lines covering war? There are in other parts of the world, but not as much in Asia. When we had the India-Pakistan standoff and journalists were traveling to Kashmir, most of us were not, you know, we were the second choice, really. The first choice were really men who could, you know, who could get the stories out. I remember one of the editors saying, you know, what if we get your periods during the India-Pakistan standoff when you're in Kargil, and there won't be much of, you know, it's the kind of reasoning that is being given to women journalists on the field. I think that mindset needs to change, but we are changing. I mean, women in India, in Indian television, are no longer just petty faces. There are also women who do great journalism, and there is a change also because at this point of time, Narendra Modi, who is a majoritarian leader, the biggest pushback against him is coming from the women investigative journalists. And there are some four or five of us who are doing the best of journalism. And I think that we are setting an example in a way, and I hope that we can perhaps bring about a change in the next couple of years, because India, the world's largest democracy, is looking at a change. Let's see, let's hope for the best.
Could I pick up on the issue of manels and programs that are entirely men? One of the reasons I started 50/50 was I had a couple of conversations with program makers, and they were saying, yeah, well, we have a rule where we don't make a program with no women. And I was like, can we not set the bar a little bit higher here? Like, you know, of course we're not making as much progress as we could if that's our definition of success. And one of the things I tried to do with 50/50 was sensitize the people taking part, so that if you aren't fairly representing women in your journalism, you notice it and you feel it. It doesn't mean you're always going to be able to do it, but at least you see it and you expect this of yourself. And then the second thing to what you've just been saying, Rana, let's try and reimagine our definition of expertise. Our traditional definition of expertise within journalism is the people with the most power. And the people with the most power in the world are men. But actually, they're not necessarily the most expert. There are lots of people who can give you a perspective on a business story, not just the CEO. There are lots of people who can help you understand politics, not just the political leaders. And as such, we have tried to really reimagine on my program, Outside Source, who do we consider expert on the stories that we're covering? And by doing that, we haven't just diversified our sources in terms of increasing the number of women. We've actually diversified our sources in a whole range of ways. And I would argue we've made our journalism much better. And so the traditional view of experts and of contributors is you have to speak to the most senior journalist, you have to speak to the most senior politician, you have to speak to the most senior business leader. There'll be times when that's appropriate, but there is a vast reservoir of expertise within our organizations and within our societies which we're not making the most of, and I would argue if you do, your journalism will benefit.
Thank you both very much. I think we have less than 3 minutes for questions.
Hello, my name is Angelina Koryakin. I'm from Ukraine, and I have a question regarding pay gaps. So we see that a lot is changing in terms of representation and equality, but how does it work, and especially for the BBC, after BBC published the list of the highest paid employees, how does it change in terms of gender pay gaps? Thank you.
So you give me this kind of question with 2 minutes to go. Look, I'm not a BBC manager. 50/50 is not involved in how much people are paid at the BBC, so this is completely outside of my area of expertise and responsibility. I think the only thing I would offer is that the BBC, as most of you will know, is obliged to publish the salaries of everyone who earns more than £150,000 a year, and that transparency has driven some quite fundamental shifts in how pay is discussed at the BBC and how BBC management is approaching pay at the BBC. You'd have to ask BBC managers whether they deem that to be a development that they would welcome, but there's no doubt that transparency has shifted the discussion in quite a profound way, and so that's an option for all organizations to consider. The other thing I would say is that, of course, if an organization, a journalistic organization, wants to pursue gender equality in a range of ways, it's not going to work if you do one thing which is committed to gender equality, but another thing which appears to be counter to it. And I can't speak for BBC management, but I have heard them say in speeches that they would consider their approach to gender equality to be across the board and that it needs to manifest itself in lots of different ways. Of course, it's for others to decide whether they're managing to do that.
I see a question at the front as well, right there.
Hi, I'm Nancy. I'm from Greece. I'm from a PR agency, and I have a question for you both. The work that you're doing with 50/50 and your investigative journalism, of course, is a hopeful thing for all of us. Have you any idea if it's already resonating with your audiences?
I do think it's resonating with the audiences because, I self-published my investigative book 3 years ago without any publisher. And the body of work was so interesting and it made such a splash that 3 years later, I'm 700,000 copies down in 16 languages and I'm the most followed journalist in India. So it is, when you do good journalism, you will find it resonating with the audience, which is part of good journalism. There isn't good journalism in a lot of countries, especially ruled by strongmen. So good journalism always finds good readers and good subscribers and viewers.
To our excitement, people have noticed. So we have a lot of anecdotal evidence that people are saying, my goodness, all the biggest news programs the BBC makes sound and look very different. This is exciting. We did a big piece of audience research, which we released in May, which found that 1 in 3 people surveyed had seen a shift in the last 18 months. And if you specialize in audience research, for 1 in 3 people to notice any difference is beyond your wildest dreams. So we were thrilled to see how quickly the audience had noticed a shift. And just one story to finish on. Last week on Twitter, I noticed that a viewer in Scotland had sent a message to a program we make in Scotland saying, hey, nice program, but what about the 50/50 project? Your representation didn't seem to be what it should be. And if we get to the stage where our audience is coming back to us and saying, hold on, you've said publicly that you're doing this, make sure you do, well, that's a really powerful dynamic because, of course, we go to work each day to serve our audiences, and if our audiences are demanding it, then you're going to be all the more motivated to do it.
Thank you both very much for being here and for answering people's questions.
I'm sure you enjoyed this session, and it's very powerful.